Hi, I'm Effi. I'm a fantasy writer with a literature degree, and I love creating imaginary worlds. If you like escaping into stories, you might feel at home on this channel. A year ago, I cut a tendon on my ring finger when I broke a glass, and I wasn't able to type for several months. I was just in the middle of writing the second part of my fantasy trilogy, and I wasn't willing to stop. So, this is the story of how I decided to write 2 novels by hand and what I learned on the way. I want to share how this process could be a useful tool for you as well. So, I had been building this fantasy universe of Lilith's Garden for several years, and I was in the writing flow in the middle of the second book. But that was interrupted by a clumsy accident I had when I took a glass out of the dishwasher and broke it, and one of the shards cut deep into my ring finger and cut the tendon. After the surgery, I wasn't able to write for several months. My left hand was completely unusable, and I wasn't willing to type only one-handedly because that was really slow and honestly miserable. So that meant I either had to change my writing routine or lose all the momentum that I had built until that moment. My first thought was to find some kind of workaround, and I tried typing one-handedly. It was incredibly slow without using my left hand, so that's when I decided to do something different. I had always loved collecting fountain pens, beautiful ink pens, notebooks, all stuff of that sort, but I never really thought of using it to write a whole novel because it seemed to me impractical and in the end, I would have to type out everything on the computer anyways. But in this situation, I didn't have a lot of options, so I just decided to try writing by hand and see how it goes. And I went out first to buy a big notebook because I knew that I didn't want any loose pages. I didn't want to lose anything of my writing. That's horror. So I used something like this. This is one of the notebooks I used to write my story, pretty big and solid and not easy to lose. The first few weeks were an adjustment because I wasn't used to writing so much by hand, and you can imagine the fingers start cramping. It feels hard actually. It feels like some kind of exercise for the hand that it doesn't usually do if you're just typing. And my writing speed dropped significantly. I wasn't able to write as many words in a day, in a session, as I was when I was using the computer. But there were also other effects that I hadn't anticipated. I noticed that it takes me much less time to get into the creative flow when I'm writing by hand than it would when I just use a computer to type. I also did less overthinking because I didn't have the option to just delete and rewrite everything immediately. On the paper, you don't want to cross out too many lines. It becomes unreadable. So you just have to flow with what's there and just continue, and that helps to get into the moment more and focus really on the writing. So that helped me to not get stuck in a endless circle of self-correction and editing while I was still in the creative process and not yet in the editing process. So that was my first lesson in writing by hand, to embrace the slowness and also the advantages that come with it, the immersion and the improved focus. And of course, there's the advantage that there's no notifications, no open browser windows, no tabs, nothing that will distract you from writing. There's just a page, a pen, and your story. Later, I discovered that it's actually not just a personal feeling that I had, that there's scientific backing to this experience. The act of handwriting actually activates your brain in a way that typing doesn't. When you're typing, you're just hitting the same keys over and over again. But when you write, your brain coordinates a complex set of motor skills and sensory feedback just to form each unique letter. A study from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology found that handwriting leads to more elaborate connectivity patterns across different brain regions compared to typing. This widespread brain connectivity helps memory formation and encoding new information. Basically, writing by hand forces your brain to process information more deeply. Also, you can't write as fast as you think, so this whole handwriting forces you to slow down and choose your words more carefully. For me, it helped stop the habit of constant self-correction and editing way too early when it's time for creativity, and not yet that critical mindset of editing that should come much later. What started out as a necessary change turned into a practical system later. I wrote 2 whole novels by hand, and on the way I noticed that I need certain strategies to help me keep organized and not lose the oversight of these very complex plots, all of the characters, and later in the editing process I also didn't want to have total chaos to deal with. So here's what I did. I only used big notebooks because there's enough space to actually write, and you need a lot of paper for 2 whole novels. And the binding is particularly important. You don't want any loose pages. Imagine losing a scene that you wrote with great care. That's like a nightmare, and that's why you should only use notebooks with binding. Another thing I'd recommend are these colorful stickers that you can use to mark chapters or certain scenes you want to highlight. This helps you keep the overview and not lose yourself in a handwritten novel. It's much harder to navigate in a big notebook than in a Word document, for example. So you need to use some little helpers to mark important parts of your writing. It makes sense to already think about the editing process and make it easier for yourself later. That's why I use these big post-its that I could just add on relevant pages in my manuscript. And there I would just write down any notes for later, maybe open questions that still needed to be answered, or notes about certain characters that I would need later, or maybe even a note for myself to add something later when I was editing, or to change something later. Looking back, that injury taught me a lot about my own writing process, and it also forced me to look at the things that were holding me back in the past, like issues of getting into the flow or distractions from the screen, from the internet, from my computer, and also the tendency to overthink while I was writing and already edit when it wasn't the time to edit. The bottom line is that a constraint can also be an inspiration that may be helping you discover something that you otherwise wouldn't. And let's be real, I wouldn't have written 2 novels by hand if I could have typed them, but I would recommend anybody who has issues with focus and overthinking to really try out this method of handwriting. It can help you let go of these things. So handwriting is definitely an amazing tool for writers because it slows you down just enough to help you think more clearly, all while engaging your brain on a deeper level of creativity. If you take away one thing of this video, it's hopefully this: do not shy away from taking the inefficient and slow route, because sometimes it's really worthwhile and can help you become an even better and more creative writer. Thanks for watching. If you have ever turned a roadblock into a source for creativity, let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about the messy and sometimes scary process of writing, then follow for more. See you in the next video.